We live in an interconnected world, but language can unite or divide us. In spite of their richness and depth, African indigenous languages feature nowhere at the global level. Throughout much of sub-Saharan Africa, English, French and Arabic are used as official languages. This linguistic imbalance has profound implications as language serves as a vessel for cultural transmission and identity. So, should Africa prioritize the preservation and promotion of its linguistic heritage in a globalized world? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining me from Johannesburg, Professor Leketi Makalela, Director of the Hub for Multilingual Education and Literacies at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Joining us from Lagos, Dr. Ose Nwagbo, Senior Lecturer, Department of Linguistics, African and Asian Studies, University of Lagos. And in Vienna, Professor Adams Bodomo, Chair, Professor of African Linguistics and Literatures, University of Vienna. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us in our discussion. Professor Makalela, Italy has proposed a law to fine people who use English and other foreign languages in official communications. In the Netherlands, if I can give that other example, universities there may be forced to offer at least 2/3 of the content of degrees in Dutch. From where you're sitting, does this sound odd in this era of globalization?
It doesn't. In the area or in the field of globalization or in this time of the globalized world, we bring with ourselves into the globe what we inherit. Because what we have in Africa, we have normalized the abnormal, where you can graduate at the university in Africa without having learned either an African language or learn through an African language, which is so abnormal.
So for these countries that are opting to retain or reinvigorate their local languages, what are their concerns?
Some of the concerns are, well, look, the local languages, which are all myths that we know, that some languages are not developed, they are inferior compared to others. There's a huge challenge around the attitudes towards people's own languages, because the narrative had historically enforced some ideas that there are languages that are better than others, and because of that people have assumed that to be a material reality, which is affecting kind of decisions that they make. The next one is cost. That is going to be costly to develop or use a local language. And this cost is, again, is a narrative that is mythical, untested, and they're talking about costs without looking at the benefits, and they're using the cost-benefit analysis model, which is an economic model, where you need to look at both the costs and the benefits to come to a decision. But there's this big ura, I'll call it the noise around how it is so expensive, when in fact we're not talking facts.
Right. Professor Bodomo, let me get your thoughts on what Professor Makalela has talked about. And these countries that are reinvigorating their local languages, do you find it a little bit of a concern in this era of globalization? Because you're in Austria. What are you seeing in terms of policies around local languages?
I'm not surprised that these countries are insisting on promoting their own languages. I mean, in Austria here, it's a German-speaking polity, and German is prime. I mean, you of course, even though they think about other languages, but German is the most important language for them. And so we in Africa have to go beyond these colonial languages like English and French and Portuguese, and get on board with promoting our own languages. Without linguistic pan-Africanism, we cannot promote a political pan-Africanism. We cannot promote economic pan-Africanism if we do not focus on linguistic pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Right, Dr. Nwabo, let me come to you on that issue of promoting pan-Africanism using language. Looking at Africa's scenario, the dominant official languages on the continent still remain the colonial languages, English, French, some Arabic, and a sprinkle of Kiswahili. So what factors do you see contributing to underrepresentation of African languages on the global stage?
Well, I think the major problem to me is the attitude of Africans towards their indigenous languages. Yes, we understand the facts that have been raised about multiplicity of, that is the number of languages that are competing, and then the use of English. But if the people are willing and committed to using their language and projecting their language, I think the cost of doing so will not be a problem. The fact remains that the attitude of Africans towards their languages is negative. They feel that their language is a handicap instead of a resource that they can use to better their lives and advance their cause politically and economically and otherwise.
Right. So there are different issues for different countries. And I want to come to you, Dr. Bodomo, first of all, because if we talk about African languages on the global scene as opposed to African languages on the domestic front, there are perceptions that African languages are less valuable or less prestigious compared to the dominant global languages. Do you agree with this?
No, we're making it like that. We're making African languages seemingly less valuable than other languages. I think that, as I said, in my theory of linguistic pan-Africanism, as I've always mentioned, yes, there are different levels of looking at these things. You know, you have to look at language at the base, you know, at the middle, and at the top. Now, that your question is at the top. It's a question about the top. But let me come down to the base. You see, in linguistic pan-Africanism, every African child should be given the opportunity to be able to read and write, to have literacy in their mother tongue. No African language should be left behind in this case at that level. Yes, in every region of Africa, in every country, in every region of Africa, there are some languages that come up, which we call lingua franca. These are languages that can be used by sections of the population across who speak different languages, but who speak them as common languages. We have the case of South Africa. We have the case of even, I'll come to East Africa later on. Of course, we have the case of Nigeria, where my colleague mentioned the 3 languages. Now, coming to your question, at the international level, yes, it is us Africans who should demand the use of some of our major languages. Why cannot Swahili be at the same level as French, English, or German? Why cannot Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Zulu, etc., Wolof, Akan be promoted so that in some of the national institutions, at the World Health Organization, at the various UN institutions, even at the African Union, why do not we promote our own languages? We should be trying to speak to each other in African language. So to answer your question, just at the international level, we have an opportunity to insist on the use of our African language. I'll come back later on to talk about how we can do this in terms of setting up institutions.
All right. Dr. Nwabo, let me get your thoughts here. Why can't African languages not be at the same level of other foreign languages on the global scene? Are there any systemic biases or prejudices here?
I think a lot is changing. I referred to an attitudinal problem in the beginning, and that is the attitude of Africans to their language. That is key. That is the number one point. That is where we should start from if we are thinking about bringing up African languages to the international scene, or making our presence felt, making African languages visible the fact remains that Africans should be proud of their languages. Presently, we still speak colonial languages. Of course, we have no option than to speak it, but the attitude that we adopt towards it is a problem. We think in English, in Nigeria here, most elite think in English, they breathe in English, they even dream in English. And so English is all over us. And so because of that, it has befuddled and it has suppressed the indigenous languages. But it is possible to, grow our languages. It is very possible, especially in the light of technology, given the internet and all that, we can make our languages visible to the world. A lot is being done now.
Right.
People have taken advantage of the internet to put up programs online, teaching programs about Nigerian languages, projecting our folk tales, our folklore, proverbs, and all that. And these are there, and the languages grow.
So I want to get your thoughts briefly, Professor Makalela, on that issue.
We should understand that the African languages were put to writing by the missionary linguists, and they used their own writing systems. And because of mishearings, oftentimes between languages, and I want to insist that are mutually intelligible, are written differently. But you do have got a lot of other languages that are not being put in writing. So just to go back to, it is possible for Africans to be assertive about their languages, and development of the corpus and the orthography, that is not, you call it a train smash, is not impossible. Just the case in point that majority of the African languages we have, 80% of them belong to a family called Bantu, right? There's a variation from which region to the other region, but if they are occupying the same geographical or what we call the national space, there is mobility in those countries,
right.
And therefore to isolate, and we need to re-standardize, and it's very possible in writing. One example, look at Mandarin and Cantonese. We might call those two different languages because they are not really truly mutually intelligible, but in writing, we're able to harmonize, we're able to have a one writing system.
Right.
So it eliminates, and it also allows the possibility of Africans themselves learning other African languages, because that is not possible as we speak at the moment. Because we want to adopt ideas like this is a Francophone Africa, this is a Lusophone Africa, this is an Anglophone Africa, when in fact this is Afrophone Africa, because the indigenous people are using the languages that they use to make sense of their daily realities.
Professor Makalela, we're going to take a short break. We will continue with that conversation. It is a very intriguing topic indeed, but let's take a short break now. When we come back, we will look at some possible challenges in the promotion of indigenous languages. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Professor Makalela, Dr. Nwagbo, and Professor Bodomo. Dr. Bodomo, let me start off with you here. Is preservation of indigenous languages really a priority in a globalized world where there are more pressing social issues here in Africa?
Definitely. I mean, there are no more pressing issues than, language preservation. When we talk about, biodiversity, when we talk about preserving, some landmarks, some trees, or some, oceans, or preserving some flora and fauna. It is preserving language is equally important, because sometimes it's meaningless to preserve these things when you don't even know how to reference these things? How do you talk about preserving some rare trees and animals if you don't even know the names of these things in the area in which these plants and animals are? So language preservation has to go hand in hand with environmental preservation. Language is part of the environment, and preserving language also means preserving our cultures. It's not just only language, because language contains is a vehicle through which we express our cultures. So I would like to insist and to claim that language preservation is very important. It's as important as other aspects, other so-called pressing issues in the world, and therefore Africans must ensure that we project our languages and use them and make them part and parcel of us as we grow as nations, as we grow as part of the committee of nations.
Right. Dr. Nwabo, you know, if African countries were to relegate English or other foreign languages and upscale their indigenous languages, what challenges do you think they would likely face here?
Well, the challenges are there. If we really want to relegate English, it is a very Herculean task to do so, because English is with us here. It has been with us, and it is still with us, and I feel it will remain with us. But if we want to really intentionally and deliberately relegate English, it is going to cost a lot. It will mean that we're going to change so many things. For instance, in the school system, it's going to affect the courses that are being taught, because it means that we're going to introduce more African languages, or more in Nigeria. For example, in Nigeria, we're going to introduce more Nigerian languages into the system, and teachers have to be trained in some of these languages. Some of them are not codified yet. Some of them are not standardized. They have to go through the language planning process in order to put them into writing and make books and materials available in these languages. So these are the challenges, but they are challenges that are surmountable,
right,
if there is a political will, if the people are really committed to doing so.
Right. Professor Makalela, your view on this and how impactful it could be for local languages?
My view is not a choice of an African language or English, and I can speak from educational point of view. The point is people need to learn and access these digital technologies, and you need to deeply digest and understand so that you can be innovative. So that's what we call epistemic access. So you do need to learn through the language that you understand best. Yet you've got to learn a language that takes you outside of your geographical space to be part of the global community. You still need to learn an international language. At the moment, it happens to be English, maybe plus a few others, but it is not this and that. And I think also even within the learning and teaching spaces for African languages to get to the level where you need some kind of a gradual release where it's an African language alongside English for a given period of time, depending on your language planning prerogative. That will have a huge impact in terms of bringing Africans into the space of development. That assures our sustainable development, because the language is who a person is. You are not a human being outside of the language that you understand. You are being dehumanized. So it does help you, because we need to get into a space with confidence. Right. Just talking about the earlier question, we go into the world with a full sense of who we are, and you can only articulate your identity position and take over the world if this is what you need to do. When you're confident, you can't do that. If you get educated, in a language that you don't understand. We have got the capacity of Africans to be multilingual. Therefore, it's not about isolating or elevating one versus the other. We can do all.
So I want to get your solutions and your thoughts on the kind of policies and regulations that we could adopt in order to protect indigenous languages. Let me start off with you, Dr. Nwagbo. What policies or regulations should African governments adopt to protect indigenous languages?
Thank you very much. There are certain policies that could be adopted, like such as the language in education, and that is very primary because the academic area is a field where professionals are who can help better to project the language to the outside world. So I think that would be a good place to start in terms of policies. Mm-hmm. Policies have been made across Africa. All African countries have language policy, be it overt or covert. And but it's important to have a mother tongue based or indigenous language based policy that projects the indigenous languages. For instance, in Nigeria, the policy doesn't really favor the indigenous languages in Nigeria until recently. It was in 2022 that the government of Muhammadu Buhari redesigned the policy to favor indigenous languages. They made it that every child in primary school should now be able to study an indigenous language from primary school mm-hmm. Throughout the primary school education. That is, the indigenous language will be a medium of instruction throughout, unlike what obtained before, where children are taught in the indigenous language up to class 3 or elementary 3, and from there they will start being taught with English. And then there are other ways that it could also be done. General studies program universities, if indigenous languages are involved in general studies program, it will expose the languages to a majority of students. All students will take it as a required course. It may not be weighted, but they are required to pass it before they graduate from universities.
Right.
So I think these are some of the measures, some of the policies that could be introduced to enhance the indigenous languages.
Dr. Bodomo, your thoughts?
Yes, the government has a big role to play. I'm from Ghana. In Ghana, we, as Dr. Abo just mentioned, in Ghana, every child has a possibility to learn their mother tongue and is examinable at the basic levels of education. So yes, we were implementing what I call the base in terms of my theory of linguistic pan-Africanism. But another thing we also do in Ghana, and I think that can be shared by we can share with other countries, is that we encourage people, citizens, to learn others languages. So there was a government in Ghana called the Ashampun government in the 1970s that said that every Ghanaian is encouraged to learn another Ghanaian language besides their own. In so doing, people get good attitude towards other languages. And I also think that the African Union itself has a duty to do this. You see, when citizens see that languages are valued at the very top, then they'll begin to learn. The African Union must insist on using African languages at this meeting, at the very top of this meeting. You cannot continue to use English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, and only, of course, Swahili is there, which is good, but more languages should be. So when citizens see that African languages are being valued at the top, then they will begin to appreciate them. A third possible way we can increase this language is to also look at developing some regional lingua franca. Like a lingua franca is a language, a common language that is used by different. So that if you can project in West Africa a number of lingua franca, in East Africa there's already Swahili, but there are also other languages there. In Southern Africa, if you can do this and so that people can learn these languages as they interact with other Africans, we cannot talk about continental African free trade area and still continue to use only English and French in promoting, in doing business with each other. In the past, Africans, before colonization, Africans actually used African languages, lingua franca, to trade with each other. Why are we suddenly leaving that legacy behind,
right,
and we are trading with each other in English, French, and Portuguese? We should be able to use some of our major lingua franca, some of our major languages to trade with each other. These are some of the reasons and some of the things we can do to promote African languages.
Professor Makalela, you have the final word very briefly.
I can't agree more with the professor who just made valuable points. And the point is you cannot be in an African university and get out of the system, have a degree without having learned an African language. That's one policy imperative there for African countries. What that does, it brings prestige to African languages, and you are sure that other Africans learn other African languages because there's a huge market right out there that will elevate the status of these languages and put a market value to them. But secondly, to your question directly, we need dynamic policies away from what we have at the moment. We think about African languages or languages generally as isolated entities that are sealed in boxes. So we took up policies that are so vertical in nature when the reality among Africans is that the way they communicate, the way they make sense is so fluid that we talk about a different type of multilingualism which is more horizontal to accommodate how people in everyday speech do that, even though we might name these languages. South Africa has taken a stance, and this is one good piece of good news, that we will have a mother tongue, what we call mother tongue-based bilingual education, so that what my colleague from Nigeria said about this, thing that doesn't make sense, that you make African children to swim or sink in grade 4. It will be out of our reality from 2025, because then you'll continue with an African language, the mother tongue of the child, while you are carrying English alongside. That's why it's a bilingual, dynamic bilingual policy that allows for gradual development of an African language alongside English, because mutual borrowing is possible. English itself having benefited from languages such as French, and is borrowing 80% of words in English are not English. So African languages cannot be preserved, put in cocoons, where we say we preserve them by not bringing them into the space.
Right.
I think this is the direction for many African countries.
Right, gentlemen, very intriguing discussion, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Professor Leketi Makalela. Professor Leketi Makalela is the director of the Hub for Multilingual Education and Literacies at the University of Witwatersrand. Dr. Austin Nwagbo, Senior Lecturer, Department of Linguistics, African and Asian Studies at the University of Lagos, and Professor Adams Bodomo, Chair Professor of African Linguistics and Literatures at the University of Vienna in Austria. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and do watch these and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.